Yes, so hello everybody. It's a pleasure to continue with our Lotman course, this time a bit in different format, completely in Zoom, but it is for us a possibility to have very far guests, and we are really happy to have it here today. Professor Laura Gherlone, who is a professor of Russian literature at the Catholic University of Argentina. So she has just wake up yeah, we are particularly thankful for agreeing to do the lecture in the early morning for Buenos Aires. About Laura, I think it's right to say that she's one of the best experts of later, so Lotman's works, and particularly the period beginning after the semiosphere. And her book, which was published in 2014, is titled exactly Dopo la semiosfera in Italian, which is after the semiosphere, and it contains also Laura's work, but also new translations of Lotman's later essays. Laura has worked particularly on the so to say explosive phase of Lotman's thought, the issues of history, unpredictability, the explosion has been at the center of her work. And I think more recently also the role of emotions, of affects in history, which is a very interesting topic in relation with Lotman. And I think today she will talk a bit more about it. So Laura, please, the screen is yours.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniele. Just a moment. No. Perfect. Can you see?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Daniele and Merit, for the presentation and the invitation. For me, it's an honor, a pleasure. My life is linked to Estonia because I spent part of my PhD in Estonia, and it was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. So for me, it's a special moment here to be here with you. And Daniele present me. I had just that 2 weeks ago, I became a member of the National Scientific Technical Research Council of Argentina. So this gave me the possibility to follow to work on Lotman. Well, the title of this contribution is Lotmanian Explosion and Cultural Affect Theory. I will address three thematic areas. The first one, the Lotman of the later years and cultural affect theory. The second, I will talk about the concept of explosion in Lotman's theory, and with particular attention to the problem of knowledge and the problem of evolution. And the third thematic area, the third point, how the Lotman theory could be a dialogue with the affect theory, and in particular the concept of atmosphere, uncertainty, and change. I start this contribution by providing you with an overview on the late period of the Lotman intellectual production. I'm going to read my contribution, but if you have questions, comments, or simply doubts, you can stop me and I give you the word. Well, Lotman was aware that the period 1990-1993 was witnessing the maturation of another way of thinking with respect to his previous intellectual production. Although there were clear lines of thematic continuum at the beginning of the 19th, his way of expressing and speculating made increasing use of intuition, metaphors and analogies, suggestions and memories. Reflexive explosion, we could say. He himself wanted to crystallize this change through the publication of a collection of articles to be published with the Alexandra Publishing House of Tallinn. The collection, as Tallinna pointed out, should have been opened by the essay Monostructure and Binariness, an article from 1991 that you can find in the form of manuscript in the Tartu University Library, Unit 268. I took the opportunity of this presentation to include some bibliography if you can further explore this topic. So if you read Russian, you can read Tallinna Kuzovkina, this beautiful article on the topic of death in the late writings of Lotman. Some critics have suggested that the Lotman of the later years lacks the systematicity of the early structuralist writings. I believe instead that he adopted a language and a form of expression consistent with his life experience, marked by the idea of unpredictability and astonishment. And I think that it was fundamental, the role played by Pushkin, because, just a moment, because Pushkin taught Lotman that life is a combination of logic and providence in understood as the chance and the accidental. On one hand, Lotman's later works introduced evident thematic novelty, crisis, revolution, and historical semiotics, collective emotions, the philosophical reflection on death, inspiration, and the epistemological reach of the creative artistic moment. On the other hand, they brought to fulfillment his semiotics of culture, developed throughout 40 years of research, a scientific approach fostered by him together with the school of Tartu in order to explain how very complex organisms, such as cultures, can elaborate their own models of self-consciousness and self-description. In other words, their identity. An identity that inevitably shapes the identity of people, created a shared imaginary, a common memory, and a collective self-representation, traceable through the cultural narratives and the textual constructs. One of the main research questions of the Lotman of the later years could be formulated as follows: how ossified collective narratives can influence, if not determine, the path of a culture? In my investigations, I link this research question to the so-called cultural affect theory, a field of study focused on the idea that narratives are not only cognitive vehicles, but also affective media that act and resonate at the level of the social fabric. And consequently, they can deeply influence the events, namely the assessment of past experience, the judgment about the potentiality in flux, the perception and anticipation of the future, by accelerating or slowing down the change. Furthermore, emotion-imbued narratives can stock, reproduce, and spatial temporally reiterated power asymmetries of race, class, and gender, textually sedimented over time. For this reason, as I pointed out at the end of this contribution, I believe that the Lotman theory could enter in dialogue also with the decolonial reflection of the Latin American tradition. And here I'm quoting a phrase of Schlaby and Muloff, two experts in cultural affect theory. How an individual can affect and be affected is a result of a kind of bodily and environmental repository for specific patterns and of affectivity in past relations. This repository works by means of sedimentation of past patterns of affect into the potential, which are thus present as potentials in current relations, co-shaping and individuals' affects, actions, and embodiment. So repository of affect that can be present in the present time and influence the future. These specific patterns of affectivity in past relations can be grasped without taking into consideration central narratives of a culture, stable forms and sedimented forms, invariant text, and ossified semiotic association. For example, it's typical of the Latin American reflection. They talk about or reflect on the narrative of whiteness, la blancura. Laura Turner recently, in a paper of 2020, has placed in evidence, for example, the interconnection between the artistic architectonical usage of luxury material, specifically the Carrara marble, and the historical semiotics reproduction and propagation of the race-oriented idea of whiteness, purity, and beauty, with all its baggage of emotional implication. If you can explore this topic, I suggest this paper of Laura Turner, and for a more general exploration, the essay, the article of Sarah Hamed, A Phenomenology of Whiteness, of the journal Feminist Theory. Lotman's cultural perspective, with its attention to memory and circulation of symbols, center-periphery cultural dynamics, textual emotional propagation and explosion, is without a doubt productive for the cultural affect theory. The concept of explosion is one of the most important intuition of the Lotman of the later years. The concept of explosion in Lotman's scientific thought originates from an existential experience. Of course, it's an intellectual experience, but I think that first of all is an existential experience. The vivid awareness that life, unlike chess, we cannot predict even 2 moves ahead. This quotation is taken from a letter to Boris Uspensky of the end of January 1984. This conviction led him to investigate the ways in which humans culturally shape the experience of randomness, unpredictability, and creativity inherent in life. From a theoretical point of view, the concept of explosion is linked to problem areas, knowledge and evolution. We could sum up the problem of knowledge according to an explosive point of view with this phrase: the need for incomprehension is paradoxically as relevant as the need for comprehension. Human beings, according to Lotman, have become accustomed to thinking of knowledge as a space full of holes that must be progressively saturated. The holes present untamed information, which is perceived as disorder, randomness, and contradiction. They are under the illusion that achieving full knowledge is tantamount of dominating information, namely to identify an ordering principle and together with it embedding repetition. However, human beings' real experience of knowledge, a vivid experience of knowledge, contradicts this ideal because, as mentioned above, life is not a chess game. While trying to model reality, giving it a sense and in some way another, their semiotic action appears a monstrous wastefulness. Lotman talks about monstrous wastefulness in an unpublished essay entitled In an Open World. And a monstrous wastefulness that seems to be an entropic production of information. If human beings aspire to an ordered knowledge, why do these are the questions of Lotman. Why do they prefer to express themselves through a variety of different projections of the world? Why do they dissipate so much semiotic energy? And where does this redundancy of information go? I think that these are the questions that underline the Lotman thought of the late period. According to Lotman, humans cannot be satisfied by an ambiguous knowledge, even if they were able to achieve extreme levels of communicative efficiency through artificial intelligence. Lotman come to the solution, come to the final reflection that people need translation. People seek translation. They desire to understand each other, but not at the cost of impoverishment their own perspective. Just in this moment, I'm writing a paper together with an Italian colleague, Pietro Restanio, and we are calling this approach multi-perspectivism, the approach that lies at the heart of Lotman's epistemology. Lotman identified translation as the source of our knowledge of reality, but included the unexpected as a constituent element of human communication and not a noise to be ousted. He stressed that paradoxically translation is all the more effective the more it leaves a margin for untranslatability. This, in fact, is a symptom of the fact that reality we mean to grasp is so semantically rich and or culturally distant that it can only be expressed through an approximation. That the surplus of meaning that flows from the untranslatable is not actually a vast waste, since it is never lost, but rather hovers in culture, entering a state of potential, what we could call define meaning repository. We can picture the untranslatable like air filled with pollen, impalpable, ungraspable, but potentially able to bear fruit in unpredictable times and place. When this happens, it can suddenly reveal new, unexpected, unconceivable, apparently logical and expressible relationships between things. Lotman defined this revealing moment an explosion. And here I'm quoting Culture and Explosion, the monograph of 1992. Explosion is the moment of supreme tension, which removes all boundaries of untranslatability and unites the incompatible. The explosion, while taking place in a specific space-time frame, entails the suspension of the limits within which meaning is generated and the emergence of something radically new, the result of a no-synthetic unity of difference. In this perspective, we could generate a dialogue between the conception of no-synthetic unity of difference of Lotman and the philosophy of Hegel. But we have no time here to address this topic. But there is a profound difference between the two concepts of no-synthetic unit of difference. And Lotman say, a word explosion, the word created by explosion, a word of supreme clarity, which cancels out the contradictions in the particular deep level unity. Focusing on explosion, Lotman has artistic inspiration in mind. Poetry first and foremost, which sprang him into action from the very beginning. In his later writings, he speaks in general of the experience of unpredictable creativity that humans can potentially live, a way of opening up to the world with the mind and the senses that allows a person to grasp as if in a magnesium flare the profound meaning of heterogeneity and even of the contradictions of the reality. Lotman talks about the explosion as a magnesium flare in a letter to Uspensky of 1978. It's not coincidence that the monograph, the unpredictable workings or mechanism of culture, the first version of which was entitled Physiology of Explosion on Transitional Period of History, is basically a long reflection on the role of art in human history and on its epistemological significance. In Lotman's vision, art as a form of thinking and modeling reality is what gives life its inexhaustible randomness, and at the end is the supreme form of knowledge. A thing as banal as a worn-out pair of boots, just think of Vincent van Gogh's shoes of 1886, can become an uncanny subject. And in fact, we have a lot of writings from philosophy talking about the shows of Van Gogh, an uncanny subject precisely because in art object, I quote Lotman, constrained by the laws of reality, acquire freedom and reveal an untranslatable vagueness that Lotman calls unpredictable explosion. This quotation is taken from the Unpredictable Workings of Culture. The essence of artistic cognition, Lotman Samaj, is located in the in the explosion in meaning that arises at the intersection of non-intersecting, in other situations, images of reality. We can deduce that this type of cognition is an indispensable component for humanity, and with its unpredictability, it is the closest there is to real life. Why is close to real life? Because in everyday life, instability and uncertainty are a commonplace, as well as the need for choice in conditions of high improbability and with creative implication. The Lotman of the later years propose, I think this is my opinion, propose a new cosmovision for the humanity of tomorrow, a cosmovision focused on the possibility of thinking and creating, and not foreordained constellation of events, the possibility of election. In fact, the free for choice possibility of election are one of the most present words in the last writings of Lotman. Like real life, communication is multifaceted, open and in flux and imperfect. And it is precisely this imperfection that enables the explosive moment not to reject, not to fear the crisis of meaning, namely not to reject or fear what allows human being to evolve. And here we arrive to the second perspective, second point of view from which we can study the explosion. In Lotman's vision, the problem of knowledge is directly linked to the way we imagine ourselves in history. If the growth in learning means filling the holes of knowledge, our evolution will be a progressive line which inexorably and inevitably expels the uncertainty. And Lotman writes in A Divine Pronouncement or a Game of Chance. Let us image a film that portrays the life of a person from birth to old age. After viewing the film retrospectively, we would say that this person had only one possible path, and that, with an ironclad determinism, this path ended exactly how it was supposed to end. In general, if you want to deep this topic, I suggest to read the book edited by Marek Tam in 1990. If learning means to be open to astonishment of the unknown, our evolution will be a path full of points of bifurcation, where the unpredictable is as important as the predictable. Following the reflections of the Nobel laureate in chemistry Prigozhin, who studied the so-called dissipative structures, Lotman reflected in depth about the fact that history is often perceived and described, he writes in the conversation on the Russian culture, as a train traveling at an unusually high velocity, according to a Greek narration inspired by determinism. Such a Greek narration built on ossified collective narratives, especially of Western culture, has a performative effect on events. By mapping out them in the framework of the idea, it could not have been otherwise. So framing in a sort of pre-comprehension. I suggest to read Clio at the Crossroad. It is instead necessary to cultivate a different historical thought by learning to interpret uncertainty through different eyes. This alternative look is explosion. We may synthetically say that explosion in Lotman's history-oriented later writings is a sort of breakthrough in humans' historical path, which is seen as a combination of gradual or predictable development and unexpected contingencies. When it occurs, Lotman writes in unpredictable workings of culture, the moment of explosion breaks the chain of cause and effect, causing an entire area to rise up and a collection of identically probable events to come into view. Following from the logic of the preceding developments, it is essentially impossible to predict which of those events will actually occur. We can find in this enunciation, in this phrase, the idea that life is not a chess game. No? It's impossible to predict which of those events will actually occur. Explosion is that moment when humans, finding themselves at a crossroads, perceive this crossroad as a vagueness of information, feel to be in a spatial temporal force field, or an array of possibilities, from which they choose a direction towards novelty, but possibly also toward old waves. What Lotman calls the path already traveled. Explosion is presented by Lotman through three main properties. First, he generally speaks of moment of explosion, suggesting that it is a shifting, transitory temporal conformation. At the same time, it is spatial because it implies the existence of a collective and individual subject who perceives, interprets, and evaluates it, and who is inevitably, this subject, collective individual subject, is inevitably situated in the geographic, social, symbolic location of a given culture. Second property, rather than giving a definition of explosion, Lotman describes it through the actions it performs, namely through its agency. The explosion as its own agency. If we consider the two main monographs, Culture and Explosion and A Predictable Mechanism of Workings, Mechanism of Culture, we can observe that explosion breaks, changes, carries over, through, involves, forces, occurs, renders, creates, generates, ends, results in, changes, expels, loses, penetrates, ruptures. Explosion, so as an agency, a force. Third, an agent force, almost with its own intentionality, with which encounters and clashes with the individual collective subject's force, it seems to be a mnemonic, affective, sensory intelligence that makes use of familiar image symbols from the past, something similar to archetypical schemas, to become present and graspable. And it's not coincidence that Lotman, talking about explosion, at the same time talk about the collective emotion, because explosion is as a mnemonic, affective, sensory intelligence. And through these main properties, and three main properties of explosion, we reconnect Lotman theory to the theory of cultural affect. In light of these properties, the Lotmanian concept of explosion is in fact very close to that of atmosphere. a key concept of the theory of cultural affects. If we adopt Surmatoyo and Pink definition, they are two researchers, two Australian scholars, who are working a lot on the concept of atmosphere in the sense of explosion of meaning from the point of view of the visual art and visual design. And I think that Surmatoyo Pink are one of the most expert in this field of study. And so if we adopt Surmatoyo and Pink definition, an atmosphere is a contingent and fluid outcome of our perpetually configured surroundings, sensory perception, subjectivities, and imaginations. An outcome that in the moment of its manifestation release meanings able to move forward with people and continuing to shape the understanding of their experience. Different reminiscences and anticipatory insights into the future, pre-existing views of things, bodily capacities, cultural narratives via daily discoursing and object. If you want to read more about this topic, I suggest the book Atmospheres and the Experiential World Theory and Method of Surmatoyo and Shanti, Sarah Pink, and this beautiful article, The Roles of Atmosphere in Shared Emotion of Dylan Trigg. Such atmospheric eruption or explosion does not always present itself as the space of a free choice and therefore bearer of newness and generator of original meanings, but can be conditioned by a mnemonic cultural load that undermines the result. This is because, Lotman writes in Unpredictable Mechanism of Culture, the moment of explosion is not only the point at which new possibility takes shape, but also the point at which one becomes conscious of another reality, a moment of dislocation and of the reinterpretation of memory. The agency of explosion can push towards the exhumation of ancient experience, symbolized by familiar archetypes, symbols, Lotman would say, which instead of helping to embark on the path to novelty, reproduce a pernicious past in an apparent new guise, a sort of reinterpreted script. This may happen especially in those moments marked by high uncertainty, when historical memory can lead to errors that are at times tragic in their consequences. We may define such a situation as a fallacious explosion, because while presenting itself as a moment of suspicion, it actually does not break the chain of cause and effect, nor does it generate substantially new information, or generate new information at a very high cost. He had the cancellation of previous information, such as Lotman comments in the mechanism of the period of travels. Okay, was one period of Russian history that, according to Lotman, continuously repeated in the time, over the time. On the contrary, an authentic explosion, as Lotman underlines in the published article Monostructure and Binariness, entertains a fertile bond with the past, with the past, because it can awaken in it latent, unexploded forces with great information capacity, forces capable of healing the past itself. Starting from this vision, Lotman worked on two lines of research: the issue of self-description, according to a double point of view, binary models of self-description of culture and ternary model of self-description of culture, and the topic of collective emotion, with a particular focus on mass fear. We have no time to talk about these two lines of research. So especially for the topic of historical self-description, I suggest to read the article of Daniele Monticelli, Thinking the New After the Fall of the Berlin Wall, Yuri Lotman's Dialogism of History. And also I propose to, I'm proposing two writings of me. I don't like to promote myself, but it's just to because I included in these two articles reflection about the historical self-description, a collective emotion. And how can we, so Lotman's, I think one of the most important questions of this is late production, is how we can educate ourselves to glimpse into uncertainty, a genuine, no fallacious explosion. If we think of the aforementioned essay, Monostructure and Binariness, Lotman talks about the possibility to recreate the past, not to reproduce. So reproducing in fallacious, in the sense of fallacious explosion, reproduce the errors of the past, the mistakes of the past, but recreate the past. And how? To recreate the past while allowing novelty or informative capacity to break free, it is necessary to come into contact with those forces, especially effective forces, that lie dormant, latent, but effectively active in culture. In this perspective, we could link this reflection of Lotman to the concept of ghostly time, or a time that return, affective time that return over the history, that is typical of the theory of Aby Warburg and Didi Huberman. But this is a path of research that we could develop by the time. In the Russian, according to Lotman, such forces, such effective forces, are the alien text and languages. Extraneous text and languages, also following steps of formalist tradition, allow us to defamiliarize from our usual languages and ossified meanings. In order to do this, as Lotman emphasizes in several late writings, it is necessary to bring to light the untold stories, the marginalized events, and the invisible figures of history, trying to reconstruct the untaken path or the silenced narratives. This is what allows the peripheral or dismissed past, apparently dead, to re-emerge in all its vitality and actuality, and to approach the center of culture, so dismantling partner of pernicious affectivity in past relations. And to conclude, I chose this picture this picture, turn the world upside down, because it's a picture that in general is used by the decolonial reflection. It is a historical tradition typical of Latin America that exactly is proposing to think history, descubrir, perdón, in Spanish, discover, rediscovering the marginalized stories, the alternative story, for example, the ancestral narratives, no? So I think, and this is the research line that I'm developing now, is, just a moment, my son is crying. This is the research line that I'm developing now. So creating a dialogue between Lotman theory and the historical, the colonial tradition. So I'm concluding my contribution. I'm sorry if my pronunciation in English is not so good. I hope that it was clear. And if you have suggestions, comments, or questions, and we can dialogue, and or you can write to me.
Thank you very much, Laura. I think it was very clear and very interesting too. And this idea of bringing together Lotmans and this affective theory, and also this decolonial perspective. But yes, we have time to discuss, so that I would open the floor for questions and comments to Laura.
Yeah.
Yeah, to give an example to the others, I might start. And first, thank you very much. It is truly interesting. I mean, all your work you have been doing on late Lotman has been very inspiring and very useful. And you managed to discover aspects that all the other scholars have not noticed. I have plenty of kind of reflections and comments. None of them is properly a question. Maybe one thing to start with about combining the, let's say, contemporary affect theory with Lotman's work. Maybe there is one issue that needs to be discussed or clarified, namely Lotman's approach is clearly on the collective level. He's interested mostly in the collective emotions and the collective fears and collective behaviors. While as much as I know, most of the affect theory is more on individual level. Mm-hmm. and most of the psychology in general tends to work on individual basis. So my question is, can you see there any kind of discrepancies between Lotman's collective approach and affect theory's individual approach, and what are the ways to overcome this certain fundamental difference between these two theories? I mean, have you thought about it, and do you have any comment on this?
Yeah. Yes. Well, actually, I'm working especially on the production, theoretical production of a Center of Study on Cultural Affect Theory of Berlin. No? And there, I think that the major part of scholars are working on the collective dimension. No? They, in general, who works on the collective dimension comes from sociology and ethnography and semiotics. No? And yes, but in general and originally, the affect theory is come from the psychology, no, the field of study of psychology. Actually, the cultural affect theory it's quite reciente, pardon. Recent. I'm making a marmalade with Spanish, and I think that it is a field of study in full of development, no? And for this reason, I think that history in itself could give a great contribution to this reflection on affect, more focused on the collective dimension. And yes, in Lotman, actually the individual dimension lacks practically, because his focus is exactly on the physiognomy and physiology of a culture. I think that the concept of narrative that is in general something built at a collective level can be a useful instrument to study to see the affect theory from a social collective point of view. But what I see in the research of the Center of Excellence on Cultural Affect Theory in Berlin, the investigation are incipient. No, the major part of research is dating from 1918, 1919. No? So this last 2-3 years. I don't know if I answered, but I think that is an incipient field of study.
Yeah, thank you. And I do believe indeed that there is this trend toward collective, the study of collective emotions and affects. Also in the field of history, we have quite popular history of emotions, which is also very much about those changes in collective moods and sort of what the important new concept is, the communities of feeling or the emotional communities and all those kind of terms that refer to these collective experiences. Yeah,
in general, I see that several critics have critiqued the Lotman due to his collective vision of culture without paying attention to the individual dimension. But I think that in the last years, with the, for example, problem linked to the algorithm, the mass communication, the waves of emotion through the digital communication, this collective dimension became more evident. And for this reason, I think that now, today, the theory of Lotman is particularly pertinent, particularly actuale. I don't know, Daniele, actual.
Yeah, actually, topic, relevant topic for today.
Topic for today, exactly. And at the same time, I discover with astonishment that this collective dimension linked to the affect theory is incredibly fruitful for the Latin American studies, because they are in the full of discernment, in the full of understanding of the colonial experience, where the affect dimension, cultural affect dimension, is fundamental. And for the reason, I have the impression that the theory of Lotman is very, very topical for this current of social historical tradition here in Latin America.
Yeah, Marek.
I have some other questions, but maybe somebody else would like to interfere before I move on.
And I want just to underline that for me it's an honor to have Marek Tam here, because I'm a fan of Marek. I read everything he produced. And so for me, it was very inspiring, your work, and he asked me to to think about the theory of cultural affect, history, and Latin America historical tradition. So I take the opportunity to say thank you.
Good. And when I will ask also something, or there are remarks that, as Mark was saying, I also, so it's really good to listen to you, because there's things that I haven't thought about Lotman theory of explosion, and then I wanted to, if you could expand on a couple of them. One was this of a distinction that you made between authentic and inauthentic, so explosion. So I have always understood it that the explosion can have a destructive or a creative outcome, but so both are kind of authentic explosion, simply that it happens, and sometimes it's destructive, sometimes it's creative. So it was interesting for me to listen to this idea that is still one is authentic and one is not authentic. If you could expand on this a bit. And the other thing is that it's really interesting, this idea of the agency of explosion, because I have also always thought to the explosion as it opens a space for the agency of people. So it's a space of freedom, of choice, and of chance too, but of possibilities. So as you were saying, the bifurcations or moments. But what about the agency of explosion itself? So how do you?
In itself, yeah. Yes, the idea of agency of explosion came when I read articles and production about the atmosphere, because several writings, several scholars who are writing about atmosphere, that is another recent topics under investigation in the last years, talk about the intentionality, the agency of atmosphere, not of the people, in the sense that they, and actually I lead a lot of experience here in Argentina, where I can say that atmosphere has its own agency, in the sense that the combination of the place and the space, and in this perspective, for me, it's very important. It's fundamental, because the Lotman thing is originally is a things focus on the space, no? So the relationship between space, the time, the moment, the people, and the articulation of the situation, in general they talk about situation, create a sort of energy, a sort of field of forces that push people, influence people, suggest in a certo sentido, what people think, what people have to do, what people. So when I read these papers on the atmospheres, I found a strong relationship with the explosion, because I'm rereading the articles, the monographs of Lotman. I saw that when Lotman talks about explosion, he in general don't talk about people in the explosion, but the action that explosion do. No, so I think that it's a sort of, again, the field of study in progress, where we can study how this relationship between space, time, things, people bring to light and this sort of energy that link, connect people with memories, with old experience, but also with the perception of the future. No. So my current research is exactly focused on this topic, and I think that, but I have to go deep in this idea that the digital space can be interpreted as a sort of space-time for the explosion, but this is as an in progress reflection. And yes, this distinction between fallacious or unauthentic explosion and authentic explosion is my interpretation. Of course, Lotman doesn't talk about authentic and fallacious, but when we talk about the binary systems, it seems to see this kind of explosion, how an explosion potentially be a fruitful explosion, but its agency, it's linked to previous experience sedimented in the affect space-time of the explosion, doesn't lead to bring to light the real new information. So yeah, I think that it's an authentic of fallacious explosion is an heuristic distinction. I think that in real life we can't identify so precisely an authentic explosion, but I think is a distinction in order to start to educate to this historical thought and see in the uncertainty, in this moment of crisis, the opportunity to go toward the new ideas, new perspectives, and feeling the perception of the future. My idea is that Lotman, what he was to say to the future humanity was to not to take the load, to be passive in front of the load of the past, but learn to feel the future. I don't know, he said to perceive the newness of the future.
Thank you. Other questions?
I take the opportunity to say hello to Tatiana. Hi, Tatiana. I'm fan also of Tatiana. Hi, Tatiana. Nice to see you.
I can hear something, but it's not.
I have a question or a comment, maybe, or just reflecting upon what was said before also by Marek and Daniele about this Lotman's tendency to focus more on the collective level, but at the same time, especially in connection to explosion, I think he goes quite a lot back and forth between the individual level and collective level. But what's interesting is that this individual level explosions, it's always connected to creativity, and then on collective level, he focuses more on this destructive force. So depending on the level, the nature of explosion also changes. Or I don't know, maybe do you know any examples of where he would actually discuss this individual explosion of artists in the form of destruction as well?
Yeah, Mary, it's true. It's true. In fact, I think that what Lotman doesn't develop is how to transfer this dimension of individual dimension, the inspiration, the creative moment, the explosion of ideas, of the future, of the unpredictable insight on the reality, how to transfer this individual intimate dimension to the collective level. But in this perspective, I think that Lotman doesn't couldn't develop, due to the, of course, the death, develop this perspective. But it's true that there is this this connection. But yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, I just also remembered that in some of his later like writings or essays, when he talks about also the social explosions, but thinks about it already in his own time more directly in what's happening around him, he also kind of becomes a bit less enthusiastic about this creativity of explosion, and then develops this much more cautious kind of stance towards the change that is happening around him, or how this, again, the research object influences the concept itself as well, it seems.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I would have, it's a bit vague question. I was wondering, in talking about affectivity and its effect on explosion, do you think of affectivity in that case as something as hierarchically related to it? It's like sort of downward or upward causation towards it, or is it just meanings that are in the same space? There's no hierarchical relation between them. If it's understandable, how do you see this?
Mark, hierarchical. I don't know if I understood well.
Yes. That is this affective meaning? Is it something that is sort of like higher or lower level meaning in a culture that exists there, and then these new meanings will come consumed under it or somehow, or are they like same level phenomena, let's say?
I don't know.
Okay. So I cannot explain it much better right now.
I mean, do I understand correctly? You want to ask that between the species? I mean, it's that, or are you talking about human level, Mark? I mean, hierarchy in what sense? Hierarchy within human culture, hierarchy within the whole life systems?
Well, in human culture, perhaps.
Okay.
I guess.
Hierarchy in meanings that are released during the explosion?
No, I mean kind of the relation of so during the explosion, that the meanings that let's say the systems that between which the interpretation is happening, and is this affective level, is this kind of hierarchically above these systems that are kind of causing the explosion through their interpretation? And is that the kind of how we should understand this explosion? That the explosion is happening between these two systems, and it is affected by this affective level that is above them.
I think I should think about your question. In this moment, I have not an answer, but could I ask you to write to me, Mark?
Yes. If I will put the clearer words, I can write this.
No. The problem is mine. Probably, I in this moment I can't give you the inspired words. But if you can write me your questions, I can take my time and give you a feedback.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Because I don't want to say something that I'm not sure to.
Yes. But it was interesting what you talked about, definitely.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thank you. Some other questions? We have still 10 minutes if we want. And
I will bring maybe a new topic into the game. I very much agree with you that that the sources of late Lotman's thought are in his own experience and the changing environment. But still, I think that also we should explore the intellectual sources of his late thinking. And I wonder, what is your take on this? I mean, I can see from your own presentation that, for instance, the whole idea of these, let's say, dormant but still active resources in culture goes back to the cybernetic theory. And I feel that most of his idea of this noise being important comes directly from his interest in late 50s, early 60s in cybernetics. So it would be interesting to see to what extent still the cybernetic theory is present in his late thinking. Then also I can see that his theory of, let's say, multiple temporalities, that culture moves in different speeds, which is also very important to understand the idea of explosion and his late thinking. This seems to come directly from Yuri Demyanov's work, which elaborated this same idea of, let's say, different levels in cultural evolution. And then also, of course, you mentioned Prigozhin. It was an important source of kind of inspiration, and much of his Lotman's ideas about these kind of dissipative structures and the way explosion happens also seems to be heavily dependent on Prigozhin work. And you made interesting connection to Abi Warburg, which is indeed very, very, very important and even unexpected connection. But I do agree that in late Lotman's thinking, one can see many elements of Abi Warburg's thinking. And so, yes, I mean, that's a whole important field of study, let's say, the intellectual sources of late Lotman's thinking, but already to have any idea which are the most important sources for his late thinking.
Yeah, what I'm fascinated of explosion, this last period of Lotman, is that is starting from this ecosystem of ideas, he developed in 40 years. He comes to think about the theory of explosion, for example, without, I'm almost sure, without knowing directly Abi Warburg, but he comes to think, to elaborate a theory that has an echoes with other with an air, I don't know, an air, and yes, an ecosystem of ideas that was typical of Europe in that period, no? So for me, it's very, and for this reason also, I think that Lotman is incredible scholar, no? Because a very free mind.
So if I can kind of summarize your answer, you are saying that he was very much inventing his own theories, and the crossovers with other theories are like coincidental, so that actually he was not relying on previous scholars, if I understand correctly. But then, of course, it's a matter of, it's interesting discussion actually, whether to what extent Lotman was, developing his theories completely independently, and to what extent he was still relying on earlier authors and scholarship. And this is interesting topic. I don't have myself a clear answer. I think Tatiana might know well what kind of books Yuri Mihailovich was reading at his last years. But I think it's important, because sometimes I also feel that we might sort of overemphasize Lotman's originality, that sometimes actually he very clearly draws on earlier thinkers, but he's not very keen to reveal his sources, because his references are very random and mostly to literary sources. But I still believe that at some points he had also, let's say, other scholars on whose shoulders he was sitting.
think that there is a core of originality in the late Lotman. No, we can of course we can understand the Lotman of later years without taking into account the tradition. No, his 40 years, not only of the Lotman theory, but also the dialogue with Lotman in the school of Tartu and the members of Moscow, no, the Moscow school. But actually in the late Lotman, I see a sort of a jump. That, yes, I don't know, but I think it's linked to the existential experience, something like magnesium flare, no, and yeah, it's explosion, an intellectual explosion of himself, how he wanted to. Yes, to make a jump into the theory without not necessarily be so systematic as in the structuralist writings, but trying to offer something that probably he couldn't close, couldn't finish, no? But I think that this period focus on the explosion and unpredictability as something absolutely original. Of course, in light of the dialogue with Prigozhin and other scholars, no? But I don't know, Tatiana, which is your perspective? But I think that this period has something very, very original that is topical today. No? Topical today.
Okay, Mario.
Hi everyone, and thanks Laura for this very thought-provoking talk. When you were talking, I had in mind the fact that there are some emotions that are connected specifically on memory, no? And you said that, quoting Lotman, that explosion could be mnemonic, affective, sensory intelligence. And I really like these 3 words before the word intelligence, in particular because came to my mind that I'm working on affect theory from the perspective of nostalgia, for example, no? That kind of emotion that are connected to memory, specific to memory, to temporality. And for example, when you proposed your heuristic categories, for example, non-fallacious explosions, came to my mind the fact that the idea of reproduce the past could be considered a sort of, you know, emotional attitude to interpret the past. So it's not a real question, but just to say thank you for your contribution. Thank you to bring together these 2 elements, the idea of explosion by Lotman and affect theory. And just to say that I think it will be very useful also in the field of memory studies, no? That field that are studying specifically not just memory interpretation of the past, specifically connected to emotions, for example. So was just for sharing this, just a compliment for your presentation and this idea that I think it's quite interesting, that maybe we can, if you can say something more about the non-fallacious aspect of explosion, because you made that a difference between the creation of the past and reproduction of the past, that I think it's quite interesting. It could be also interesting if you can find what kind of emotions are connected to this kind of reproduction and recreation. I don't know if I was clear.
Yeah.
But again, thank you.
For example, 2 things. The Thailand trick, this scholar I was quoting in the presentation, is working exactly on the nostalgia, and in connecting atmosphere, affect theory, and memory studies. No, before he worked on the phenomenology of uncanny, and then now is working on the nostalgia. So if you want to explore this topic, I suggest to read Thailand Tree. And yes, the emotions, for example, in Latin America, there's a lot of studies on the la colpa,
fault,
the fault, exactly, as a complex emotion in state of affective state, the fault linked to the problem of the asymmetry of power, asymmetry of especially the process of colonization, and the asymmetry of power, especially linked to the ethnicity and the gender, the fault, and the affect implication in culture, no? But there's, how can I explain? There's not a list of emotions. I think that every scholar, have to deep into an emotion, no? Yeah, I don't know how to explain. Yes, there's not, in this moment, I don't know, I'm not aware of studies that embrace all emotions, no? In particular, I know this investigation on default, because this is one of the most important problem of Latin America, the impossibility of people, colonized people to take a new path, no, and following to feel sense at level of sensory, at level of affect, a level of body, of environment. This fault linked to the process of colonization, no. But if I know, if I know more investigation, I can write you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you.
Are you Italian, no?
Yes, sì, sono italiano.
Ah, okay, okay.
So grazie mille, thank you very much. I guess we should stop here. Thank you really very much, Laura, for this very interesting contribution to our little course. And so we will have someone ask in the chat. We will have a recording we will add it as a link to the Moodle program for the students. And I don't know, we will see if it's possible. So to add, I'm not sure, a Zoom recording to the YouTube.
Yes, I think we will add it.
Okay.
Why not?
Of the university, so it will be with others lectures, which is very good. And so have a nice day. So we're in.
Thank you.
And we really hope to have you here next February for the Lotman conference. And finger crossed.
yeah, almost sure I will be. I can travel in February, so we can see you. Hopefully.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Ciao. Ciao, Daniele. Bye. Ciao, Marco.
And as always, we will meet for the next lecture next week at the same time. And yeah, Peter Torok will be the lecturer this time. Bye.
Bye.